Somewhere on this table is a $7,000 Rolex Explorer. The rest are near identical dirt cheap clones from AliExpress, the Chinese equivalent of Amazon. Now these other watches, they aren't quite fakes. If we zoom in, you'll see none of them have the word Rolex written on the dial. Yet they're clearly cashing in on the Rolex design given the obvious similarities. These rebranded copies are often called homage watches. While some see these as no better than counterfeit, others see them as a way to wear a design that would otherwise be locked behind an extreme paywall. Unsurprisingly, these are almost always bestsellers for the brands that make them, to the extent that some brands only produce these clone designs with little to no original ones. I've always been curious though, out of all these cheap homage brands, who actually gets the closest? Who did the best job of copying, if you will? To find out, I spent a small fortune on 10 of the most popular Rolex Explorer lookalikes on AliExpress. I purchased 7 and the remaining 3 were provided at my request for this video. They start at about $50 and peak at just $250, so far less than a Rolex. I'll have them all linked in the video description if you do want to go check them out. One of our writers, Chris, also kindly loaned us his genuine Rolex Explorer as a reference point. I chose one model per brand, whichever model was the closest to this specific Rolex. The only thing I can't really test is QC. I'll rank all the contenders out of 10 in the categories you can see on screen, 1 being awful and 10 being class leading or something. It's just a bit of fun and not the most scientific, but it will keep this video from being 2 hours long. You know what was also 2 hours long? Me trying to get the right card out of my wallet in the local store. Thankfully, my sponsor Extra fixed my embarrassment with this, the super slim Parliament wallet. Their special trigger mechanism perfectly staggers your cards so you can access the one you want at the click of a button. Surprisingly, hidden within the thin premium leather housing is enough space for 12 cards plus cash. The inner RFID blocking layer even prevents opportunistic scammers from scanning your cards and taking all your savings. It's available in 6 colors depending on your preferences and can even ship with a tracker card for either iOS or Android, to help you hunt it down if you lose it. Here's a look at the Parliament wallet I've used every day since January 2024. It's in great nick, don't you think? Extra have a Black Friday sale happening right now, where you can get 50% off Extra wallets like this, and with my exclusive code BENZWC, you can get an additional 5% saving at checkout. You'll find the link for that deal in the video description. Thanks to Extra for making this video possible and not helping me lose too much money. So who are the contenders? Let's go through them and I'll talk branding, pricing, and packaging while we're at it. Of course, branding is going to be a little subjective, so let me know your thoughts on it in the comments. The cheapest on this list is usually the Benyar BY5177M. This one cost me just over £50, including import fees to the UK, or around $60 US. For the price, the magnetic box is fairly good. The brand name isn't completely dreadful, but the shield logo really is. 4.5 out of 10. Next is the Bleeger at just a hair more than the Benyar. This one arrived in a plastic bag. I'm not kidding, a plastic bag with this weird rubberized shell surrounding the case and clasp. Never seen that one before. While the brand name is perhaps a little worse and the typeface is extremely vanilla, it at least forgoes the hideous shield logo of the last one. 3.5 out of 10. For the same cost, you can usually get the Pagani Design Explorer clone. Pagani Design is one of the more well-known homage brands that have been around for many years, and the Italian-sounding name is more palatable. The branding and box are serviceable, though the typeface and icon aren't the best. 6 out of 10. Next is Terami, which cost me just over £70, including all fees. Interestingly, this one shipped in a Liege branded bag, so I'm assuming this is a Liege sub-brand of sorts. While the icon looks like a Silicon Valley startup, the brand name is one of the more Western-sounding options here, and the box is serviceable too. 6.5 out of 10. Close behind is Philida at around £80 all in. The box is bare bones at best, and the brand name is not only ugly, but also tricky to pronounce. Is it Philida, Philida, or Philida? The typeface is generic, but it isn't the worst. Thankfully, you can buy this watch with an empty sterile dial if you want to, which does boost the score a touch. 5 out of 10. After that, we jump up to Addiesdive at the £110 mark. Branding has always been the worst part of this well-known homage brand, which boasts some really overpowered watches in its collection. Sadly, their Explorer clone features the same hideous aquatic icon as most of their older models, and the bizarre brand name screams Chinese knockoff. Hey, the box is at least durable? 3.5 out of 10. Then we have this group of 3 in the 150 to 200 quid range. The first is from Cronos. My main issue with this one is that the word is similar to chrono or chronograph, but lacks the H, which leaves it looking a bit odd. The silver logo is one of the best applied though, and the padded container even ships with some decent accessories. I'd say it's better than most of the others, 7 out of 10. At about £170, Baltany offers what I think is the winner in this category. The watch arrived in a surprisingly stylish and functional leather watch roll, and the branding is one of the few you could easily mistake for being a Western brand. The name is decent enough, the font boasts some individuality but remains tasteful, and crucially small. They've also got a lineup of other good watches, some of which I've covered before. As far as AliExpress branding goes, this is like a 9, maybe a 10 out of 10. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Octopus Kraken? Yes, for the same amount of money as the Baltany, you can get a watch that will have you and others chuckling every time you think of it. The name is wild, but I have to say, I kind of like the icon. The packaging is also one of the best here, as you expect for the price. You may also notice this is smaller than the other watches. That's because they only make a 36mm version, but it's so widely praised online that I had to pick one up, even if it's not a perfect comparison. For branding and packaging though, 4.5 out of 10. Then we're left with the most expensive watch here, the San Martin. This brand has pushed the envelope over the last few years with some crazy case finishing and dials for low prices. Their leatherette cylindrical packaging is well known at this point. The logo isn't to everyone's taste, though the name San Martin is among the better ones on this list. 7 out of 10. Most of these brands also make smaller Explorer homages, which I'll also link below, though I try to obtain those closest in size to the Rolex as well where possible. So those are the brands and their branding. Let's get into the finer details, starting out with the cases and the case finishing. Now the Rolex uses oyster steel, aka 904L stainless steel, a high performance grade of steel typically only found on expensive watches. It gives a slightly better polish than the industry standard 316L and has some other niche benefits too. As you can probably gather, none of our Chinese competitors are using this material. They're all listed as 316L steel or just stainless steel, even the most expensive San Martin. The Rolex has a high polished bezel with a vertically brushed upper and polished flanks. The transitions between each section are very sharp, and overall, it's got a pretty sexy, slim profile. Now, many versions of the Rolex Explorer have been made over the years with slightly different proportions, and some of our clones are cloning those versions instead, but the vast majority of Rolex models still retain this similar finishing style and a thin steel case. Chris's unit obviously has a fair few scratches from many years of hard usage. As for which gets closest, well, it's probably better that we start with which didn't get closest. The worst offenders are the Benyar, Bleeger, and Philida. All three of these have completely polished, rounded off cases that make them look very cheap compared to the rest on the table. In fact, the Benyar and Bleeger cases are so poorly finished, I doubt they're using steel at all. The Benyar in particular is weirdly bulbous with a case that looks like it's been plucked from a completely different watch. Benyar has been exposed for lying about case materials in the past, and if you look closer at the AliExpress listing, while it says stainless steel on some sections, the spec list has the case noted just as alloy. While stainless steel is technically an alloy, when this word is used on AliExpress, it almost always means it's an inferior material, like zinc alloy or some sort of chromed brass. The case even has a different hue from all the rest, so I'd be willing to bet this is not stainless steel. While it's quite thin, the Terami watch also has a non-standard finish, with brushed flanks rather than polished ones. It's not nearly as bad as the previous three, but it's just not super close to the Rolex. The Pagani and Addiesdive are a step closer. They have the same finishing style as the Rolex, but they're both noticeably thicker, especially the Pagani. In this category, you do seem to get what you pay for. The four most expensive clones are comfortably in a tier of their own, with slim, well-finished cases, some of which look surprisingly close to the real thing. If I had to pick a winner, I'd say the Cronos just about edges it, with the most similar style of brushing to the Rolex. While we're here, we can also talk about bracelets. The original Rolex doesn't have a glide lock, but does have a solid link bracelet with brushing on top, polishing on the sides, and a silky smooth folding clasp. The typical adjustment holes line the inside of the clasp and require a tool to switch between, though there is an inbuilt extension system permitting a 5mm extension to the bracelet that you can activate by hand. Additionally, the clasp has a shape that perfectly matches the rest of the bracelet. When it comes to the AliExpress bracelets, the worst again, unsurprisingly, is the Benyar. It's got hollow end links and a rudimentary clasp with no way of making small adjustments. As a result of the polished case, it also integrates dreadfully, looking as if it's been pulled from a completely different timepiece. The Bliga and Philida also face the same bracelet integration issue. That on the Philida has a polished central link, like the bracelets fitted to other Rolex designs, which mitigates this slightly, though you are again drifting slightly away from that original Explorer look. That said, it's not awful, and neither are most of them, to be honest. Several brands have done a decent job of replicating the Rolex bracelet and clasp. The closest to the Rolex are the Cronos and Octopus Kraken, which have it nailed down to the last detail. While they're the closest, arguably the best are those fitted to the lower-cost Terami and Bliga watches, which each have a copied glide lock-like system for finer and quicker adjustments than the real Rolex. The only trouble with the Bliga is that it doesn't match that polished case, making the bracelet look again like it was pulled from a different piece. Now, the thing that Pagani Design almost pulled here was a blinder, with a clasp similar to that on the Cronos and Octopus for a fraction of the price, only to be let down by terrible screws. Like most of the options here, you remove these links by withdrawing the screws. It's normally a good system, though several of the Pagani links just spin in the holes and never come out, even with a magnetic bit. What's worse is, you can't push them through from the other side, as for some reason, the opposite end is completely sealed. I had this problem with several links, meaning that one side is cartoonishly long, and I've had to shift the bracelet to this dodgy position deep within the clasp to make it work. Quality control just seemed non-existent with this bracelet. As for the others, they're all serviceable, but stray away from the Rolex clasp design. The Philida performed well, but has a big polished central strip. Meanwhile, the San Martin, Baltany, and Addiesdive all have press-release clasps with visible micro-adjustment holes that leave them looking quite different. These are less secure, but arguably easier to use and adjust. The Addiesdive also has a dive-style fold-over mechanism, but features inferior pushpin links, which are trickier to deal with than screw links. Next, I tested all of the crystals with my diamond selector tool. Surprisingly, all but one of the watches uses a sapphire crystal, the same as fitted to the Rolex. Any guesses which was the exception? Indeed, our friends over at Benya are the only ones using what they call a hardlex crystal, which is likely a type of generic or hardened mineral glass, as hardlex is a Seiko-specific designation. While the rest all use sapphire, there are some differences between them. The Baltany, Addiesdive, and San Martin use a bubble-style crystal that's curved at the edges, likely because they're trying to imitate one of the older Explorer models, such as the 1016, which had a similarly curved crystal. Out of those three, the Addiesdive has the best anti-reflective coating, though the other two still have legibility that rivals the Rolex. The Terami also has a raised crystal, though this time it's more of a full dome shape, which isn't a style found on any Rolex Explorer watches past or present, from what I could tell at least. This makes the watch look substantially different from the others, given a slight fisheye look, and reflections are also prominent, given the nature of these domed crystals. Out of the flat options, the Bliga and Philida are the least legible. While I think some of this is definitely down to crystal clarity, some of it may also be down to the dial tones, which are both a touch lighter than the Rolex. Funnily enough, legibility is one of the weaknesses of the Rolex, to the point where it only slots in alongside the last two. While it's hard to judge, I'd call this a three-way tie between Addiesdive, Cronos, and Octopus Kraken, each having very little glare and good readability at all angles. When viewed through a watchmaker's loupe, or in your case a macro lens, the details on the Rolex all look very sharp. The metallic markers and hands are very clean with few marks. There are also no blatant QC errors. Surprisingly, considering the gulfing cost, you'd have to look extremely closely to notice any differences with these cheap clones. Now, the Benya has the worst hands and geometric markers, with some of the rectangles and the triangle at 12 having been trimmed or just painted incorrectly. Surprisingly though, the numbered indexes are some of the cleanest here. The Terami has much more respectable markers, but suffers from awkward font choices and a very low text placement, as well as a huge amount of empty dial space. At a glance, the Philida and Bliga dials look decent, but they each suffer from rough edges, minor errors, and inconsistent loom application, which show themselves when you look closer. It's a similar story with the Pagani, which looks quite shabby up close. The 6 marker in particular has been scraped to the extent where you can see the error with the naked eye. It looks pretty rough. While the loom application looks closer to Rolex than the last two, the markers are much too big for a dial this size. There's a definite step up when we get to the Baltany. This loom application is much neater and more consistent, with no overflowing areas, though the faux patina look won't be for everyone. I'm not sure the faux patina look suits the modern marker set. The hands are cleaner than the previous options, and there are fewer errors, though the 9 marker does feature some dints. The overall dial surface is also quite matte, with a slight brownish hue. The Addiesdive has the glossiest dial of the bunch, and the effect is striking from a distance. Unfortunately, like with the Terami, there's a lot of negative space on the dial, as the smaller than average markers are positioned very close to the edges. It tries to combine the modern marker set with a vintage crystal and layout, which I don't think works quite as well as the San Martin. It's fairly good under macro, though the 6 does have some notable rough edges. While the San Martin has a pastier, lower contrast dial than most on this list, which I don't love, the markers, font positioning and proportions do give this a look very reminiscent of the vintage Rolex Explorer models. It's clean and clear under the macro lens with virtually no errors and nothing obvious to the naked eye. Unlike the Addiesdive, the subtle faux lume is matched on the hands and markers, and the effect isn't nearly as strong as that on the Baltany. As far as dials go, the same two are back at it again. The Cronos and the Octopus Kraken. These both have the styling and proportions sorted, and look very close to the Rolex model we have here, even close up. While the Cronos is impressive, the Octopus Kraken is nearly flawless under macro, to the extent that I struggle to differentiate it from the Rolex. The lume color on the Octopus is a touch closer to that on the Rolex. The font and text positioning are also most representative of the real thing. Both get well-deserved high scores, but the Octopus edges it despite being a clone of a smaller version of the watch. When it comes to lume, I was wrong. In my Rolex unboxing video, I thought the low-light performance was awesome. Yet it turns out some of these cheap Chinese clones have it beaten. Now, of course, some of them suck. The Bliga, Terami, Pagani, Philida, and of course the Benya may as well have had no lume. They're all that useless in low light, each fading away rapidly. Plumb in the middle is the Baltany. Like some of the other options, it has green lume rather than the blue stuff used on the real Rolex. It's considerably better than the previous options, but still falls short of the leading pack. Then there's a jump up to the Addiesdive and San Martin, which shockingly are both on par with the Rolex from my brief testing. What's even more impressive is that the remaining two watches are noticeably better, with the Cronos narrowly edging out the Octopus Kraken, boasting the brightest showing and best overall duration. It's hard to be absolutely sure without specialist equipment, but all you need to know is that these 4 clones are great performers. I mean, they're beating a watch here that's worth thousands. Now, it's tricky to rate the movements powering these watches, as some can be bought with a selection of movements, and accuracy can also vary greatly from unit to unit. In short, here are the movements I'd pick for each model out of those currently available. As you can see, many come with well-known movements from Seiko or Miyota inside, though there are a few that stand out. The Benya, Bliga, and Philida all ship with Chinese movements by default. The Benya has the G2666Z, a low-end movement heavily based on a mass-produced design from the 1970s, the Tongji movement. It's usable, but generally has worse accuracy and longevity than others on this list. It's also thicker than most automatics, which could explain the chunkiness of the Benya. The Bliga and Philida models I have here are powered by what appear to be Chinese Miyota 8215 clones, the Mingzhu 2813 and the Seagull ST1612 respectively. The Mingzhu in the Bliga has a dreadful reliability record online, a reduced beat rate, and a rotor that somehow makes the Miyota seem quiet in comparison. I think that's the first time I've ever said that. Basically, any of the other choices for that watch will be better than the Mingzhu. The Seagull, listed on AliExpress as just a Chinese movement, is slightly better and boasts hacking, unlike the real Miyota, so it's a viable substitute and probably worth going for just to save a few quid. You'll also see the PT5000 available as a higher cost choice for some of these watches. The Octopus Kraken, for example, ships with this by default. This is a Hong Kong movement, which, unlike the last few, is top-notch from my experience. It's more reliable than the entry-level Seikos and Miyotas, and is slightly more accurate on average. Crucially, it also brings a higher beat rate, giving a smoother second-hand sweep akin to that of the Rolex. You can also get higher beat rate movements inside the San Martin, the Chinese Seagull ST2130, and the Swiss Sellita SW200. Why you'd care about a Swiss movement in a Chinese watch, I don't know. So I'd either go with the Seagull or the lower beat rate Epson YN55 if you want to save some money. The latter is apparently a rebadged Orient F6722, which isn't as smooth as a Seagull or Sellita, but is comparable and arguably a tad better than the Seiko movements in the other watches. Of course, none of them come close to the Rolex Caliber 3132 inside the real Explorer watch. This movement is COSC certified and a Rolex superlative chronometer, meaning on average it's way more accurate than the others. It's got a longer power reserve and is more shock absorbent among other benefits. This movement alone sells for thousands on the used market. So if we tot up the scores, here are the final standings. Now these are to be taken with a huge grain of salt. Some of these categories are obviously far more important than others, and the whole thing is just for a bit of fun really. However, I do think the results are similar to where I would have placed them. Of course, if you divide the scores by price, the order changes completely. However, I think this is a much less reliable value metric. I mean, some of these I wouldn't touch with a barge pole, and I don't think you should either. The Benyar might be the cheapest, but it's a complete joke, with dreadful performance in all but one category. You can't say Benyar without Ben, but that's where my endorsement ends. The Felida and Bliga are like a terrible twosome, and could well be from the same factory as each other given their similarities. They're marginally better than the Benyar, but still have numerous fatal flaws. The Pagani and Terami look a little better, but in my opinion are still worth skipping. The Terami is the more well-rounded choice, but it doesn't look much like the Rolex, defeating the whole point of it. If I were on a tight budget, I get this instead. It's the Addiesdive AD 2023. This is a 36mm Mecha Quartz watch, which I only found after making most of this video. I'll link it down below. It's basically the same as the incredibly popular AD 2030 watch from a few months ago, just with the Explorer style dial and a sapphire crystal. While it lacks the automatic movement of some of the other similarly priced options, it's better in virtually every other way. It's just a shame it only comes in 36mm. If you've got a small to average arm, it's the no-brainer cheap choice. Out of the vintage-inspired options, I think the San Martin is the best. The design is more cohesive than the Addiesdive and Baltany, and it's marginally the best built. That said, it's also the most expensive. If you're mainly focused on value, the Baltany and Addiesdive are potentially better choices, especially the 36mm version of the Baltany, which looks akin to the San Martin, but for half the cost. I haven't tried it yet, but it looks very promising, so I'll also link it below. I have to say though, the Cronos and Octopus Kraken truly are head and shoulders above everything else on this list. Except for the Rolex, of course. I'd never tried either of these brands before, and neither had any involvement in this video. I bought both of these with my own money. These are the only two that get close to that Rolex-like look and feel. The Octopus Kraken, despite the ridiculous name, probably edges it in terms of Rolex-likeness, but both are very impressive for the money. Cronos definitely has that edge on branding, and also makes a 36mm clone if you want to avoid the mollusk at that smaller size. Additionally, something that you won't have seen on the scorecards, the Cronos has a far smoother crown, which is very useful if you won't wear the watch every day and might need to wind it up regularly. If I was going to buy any on this list, it would probably be the Cronos for that very reason. I know there are many more expensive brands, sometimes Swiss brands, that make these homage style watches. To me, I kind of don't get that. I don't see any reason to spend more than this on a clone watch. These Chinese options get you 90% of the way at respectable prices. The way I see it, the more you spend, the more great original watches you could otherwise get for that money. For instance, you could buy this, a beautiful space-age watch with a super unique, luxurious look. Go on, check the video out on screen. It's surprisingly good for the money. Oh, and it looks even better in person.